Welcome and thank you for joining our webinar today, Privileged Attack Vectors and How to Build Effective Defense Strategies with security and industry expert and CTO at BeyondTrust, Morey Haber. My name is Sarah, your webinar host today. A kind reminder to please submit your questions via the chat box in the GoToMeeting console anytime throughout the webinar, and we will cover your questions at the end during our Q&A time. Today's session is being recorded, and all those who registered and attended today's session will receive a link to the recording and the slides shown here today within 1 to 2 business days from now. And a reminder that 25 lucky attendees will be randomly selected and be shipped a free and autographed copy of Morey's recently published book, Privileged Attack Vectors, now available on Amazon and Springer.com. If you are randomly selected, please be on the lookout for an email from BeyondTrust this week so that we can get your book shipped directly to you within a timely fashion. So now that that's all out of the way, I'd like to welcome Morey to the line. Hey, Morey, welcome, and please take it away. We're excited that you're here to talk about defense strategies to protect our organizations.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Welcome everyone today to discussing privileged attack vectors and building effective defense strategies to protect your organizations. My name is Morey Haber. As Sarah has introduced me, I'm the Chief Technology Officer here at BeyondTrust, and I want to talk a little bit about what this means to your business and how you can actually defend against privileged attacks. I'm going to start with a quick agenda of who I am and why this presentation is so important to you, to us as a company, the threat landscape that we are dealing with today, including modern threats like crypto mining being hosted as malware, sample use cases in terms of what we're actually trying to solve with privilege management in terms of user accounts, shared accounts, lateral movement, and then a definition of privileged access management. Unfortunately, the industry still thinks this is only password management, but analysts and other teams agree that it is much more than just password vaulting. We're also going to talk about 12 steps to mitigation, 12 very important steps to managing privileged accounts in your organization, and they don't necessarily need to be followed in order, but they're the best practices recommendations to making sure that anything privileged in your environment is properly being controlled. And then finally, a few slides on BeyondTrust. Now, for those of you who've never heard me speak before or know who I am, I've been in the industry about 20 years. I publish regularly to Secure World, CSO Online, and various other online magazines. Recently published book at the end of December, available on Amazon and Springer, called Privileged Attack Vectors, the same name as the title of this presentation, and a new book coming in Q3 called Asset Attack Vectors. It's the complementary side to this presentation of worrying about how privileged attacks occur, the opposite side basically focusing on vulnerabilities and exploits. But I've been in the industry for quite a bit of time, and I want to share some of my knowledge with you about what privileged attacks really mean and how you can protect against them. To understand this, we first need to understand what the threat landscape is. These are all notable breaches, not to pick on any one company or another, but we see these or have seen these in the news in the last year to 2 years. Each one of these, outside of the Trump Hotel collection, has had some very interesting privileged attacks. Everything from default credentials like admin to vulnerabilities not being patched in Adobe Struts to the sharing of information to third parties that have been linked to insiders compromising complex networks for financial data exchange. Every single one of these, all the way down the list, has required some form of privileges. Every single one. Whether the attacker's coming in with a vulnerability and exploit, or they've found a password on the internet that's been able to reuse, or it's a default password, somehow they've had to get admin rights or higher than standard user rights in order to breach the environment and steal information. And that's what we're trying to stop, is that movement, that obtaining of privileged accounts. So these types of breaches can be prevented. Now, when we think about it, we can look at the cyber attack chain as a game of chess. Somehow there is some form of perimeter exploitation, whether that is even insider threats becoming bad actors. There's something going on that is basically compromising our environment. Whether it's a phishing attack, whether it's crypto mining, whether it's someone being able to get a persistent presence through one way or another, they're in our environment. They're basically going to try to find a way to get privileges. That's the main goal. You need privileges to get to the database server or a file share with sensitive information that should be locked down unless it's grossly misconfigured and, doesn't have the proper permissions on it. They need to escalate those privileges to get those passwords. Now, they can use tools like Mimikatz or other techniques for pass the hash to steal it from memory from a workstation, but somehow in the end, again, they're still stealing credentials. And then they move around the environment. They're looking for other systems to attack, other systems that are vulnerable, other map drives, other resources, user behavior, to see where they can navigate through the environment to literally find your crown jewels. The attacker can start anywhere on the outside. And again, this assumes that the insider is somehow working, as a form of an outsider-type presence. Whether it's nation-state, crime rings, or hacktivists, they're using the most common techniques we see every day. Whether it's drive-by downloads, phishing attacks, direct hacking something, they're finding a way into our organization. Now, there are tons of techniques for doing this. Many of them are covered in the book that I mentioned, but think of it in the most simplest case. A threat actor is going to use the least common denominator to get into your environment, the lowest hanging fruit. What are those techniques that they're going to use to get in? Is it because I left default credentials out there? I have an easily patched vulnerability that I've missed on the perimeter? Is it a person that's running an end-of-life device that I can easily exploit when they browse to my website? Is it an iframe attack? It all doesn't matter. They're going to find a way to come in. The next step is getting privileges. If we remove admin rights from all of our desktops and stuff, malware pretty much stops. It sounds crazy, but 80% of malware, and documented by Microsoft and others, requires admin rights in order to take a hold of a system. If I remove admin rights from desktops, I can basically stop malware and many types of attacks from occurring. But when we do that, we also break applications. We also break end-user use cases like adding a printer, changing the clock, or anything else. It's difficult. Many applications still require admin rights, including running simply a Java update. So how do I handle this? Well, we have to normally give a person a second username and password that's an admin, and therefore that can be stolen from memory. We need to stop or prevent or find a vehicle to mitigate an attacker's ability to gain admin rights. We want to stop them from escalating their privileges in that environment or on that host so that whenever they then engage in lateral movement or try to engage, their permissions are basically denied. We have to stop it. The lateral movement aspect is key. In a typical network, there's no reason for two workstations to be talking to each other. There's really not. If they're on the same subnet, why do two Windows 10 machines need to talk to each other? Servers, they may need to. But we were more concerned in this case with an end user, a threat actor, basically running commands from the command line or doing something like a net use to connect to a remote system. We want to stop them from running telnet, FTP, SSH to try to find another system to compromise with the credentials they've already stolen, even if they're our standard user, and seeing if there's other ways to navigate in the environment with those creds and then escalate privileges remotely. Very, very common problem, very difficult to solve because we really don't know how our systems are intercommunicating on the same subnet. So we need ways of looking for it. We need a technique to basically view, see, and understand user behavior when they're doing something unusual in terms of lateral movement. So the most common ways threat actors are getting privileges, everything from guessing to brute force to pass the hash to exploits to predictable passwords. These are pretty much covered in the book in detail and what the different risks are and different ways they're being used, from insider threats to external threats and even hidden threats. Vulnerabilities and exploits are a completely different concept or combination because they're software flaws that basically may be patchable, mitigatable, remediable, but just not have occurred. The others are just best practice. There's no reason to be doing things like password reuse. There is no reason to have default credentials on a system. The problem is finding them, the problem is changing them, and then changing them on a regular basis. and then also making them unique. This is how threat actors are gaining access to our systems today. It's because we're not managing these most common techniques, and we have to find a way to do so. This lends us to some very, very simple use cases. When we talk about privileged access management, they really can be boiled down to 3 primary use cases. The first is employees and others having unnecessary access and rights. Let's take a little step back on this for a moment. Take a look at Windows 95. Gosh, I know that's a long time ago for many of us, but there was no such thing as real admin rights. You could hit the escape key on the login and basically get into the system. Microsoft realized that, hey, you know what? We got to do something better, because anybody could just reboot the box by hitting Control-Alt-Delete. So they made that the official login. There was no way of bypassing it. You had to log in with valid credentials. Okay, yeah, you could have booted off a floppy or CD and reset things, but take those hacks out of the equation. People were still running as admins. Microsoft then realized very seriously, wow, malware at those high 80 percentiles could infect a system, and people could change things. We could have baseline drift. We could introduce programs with malware that we didn't even know about, and they introduced UAC in its entirety in Vista, and it bombed. So what ended up happening is we ended up with a fully open model when Windows first came to the market, all the way to where we are today with Windows 10. The same is true for Mac. You boot up Mac OS today, you're an admin. The credentials that you add the first time, you're the admin. We're not thinking the way security was really meant. If you came from the mainframe or understand older security models, they started fully closed. No one had permissions to do anything. Nothing. Basically, the admins would add permissions as needed, just enough for you to do the job. It's so much easier to add a person to the admin group or super user group or something else to let them do their job than to figure out how to pull it back or tweak it. Therefore, we give too many admin rights. We just do. It's a common problem. So how do we shrink that risk surface down? How do we bring it back so it's just enough rights to do their job, but make it easy for security and IT operations and admins to manage without going, try this, try this, try this. Okay, we got the right level of permissions, but don't do that, else I have to go revisit it. It's easier to give more rights to let a person do the job than the other way around. And this has led us to having employees and others having too much or unnecessary rights. The second use case that we see across the board for privileged attack vectors is credentials are shared and unmanaged. Guys, password reuse, passwords on Post-its, too many people or more than one person knowing a domain admin name and password, the same password on a router or switch, the same password on a printer, the same credentials used on an IoT camera. It doesn't matter. As soon as those credentials, username and password combination, are used on more than one device or shared between employees, you allow lateral movement. Think about that. As soon as the credentials appear anyplace else, lateral movement can occur. So let's stop that. Let's make everything unique. Huge, hard challenge. But as soon as we wrote it on a Post-it note, it's shared. As soon as we told the other guy, it's shared. Then think about how old they are, how many people know it, what is your turnover rate, and now the problem becomes exponential. We share too many credentials. There's really no good reason to do it, even though there are use cases that say we have to. We really shouldn't. So let's get to the exception or the edge case of sharing versus making it a common practice. Now back to lateral movement. IT assets communicate unchecked. There's tons of cross-communication that should not occur. Want to understand this better? Think of WannaCry. Think of Petya. There's no reason many of those systems that infected large corporations should have allowed that ransomware to propagate. It should just not have occurred, period. Should not have occurred, okay? Segmentation, isolation, verification of communications, ACLs, all are important, especially between zones, and zones should go all the way down to the desktop or endpoint in order to isolate those systems and make sure that vulnerabilities, exploits, and the privileges associated with that cannot cross between systems. This leads us to privileged access management. What is it? What does it do for us? How can we take these use cases, understanding the current threat landscape, and develop a solution that actually makes sense? Now, privileged access management is more than just password management. Unfortunately, the industry thinks of password safe, password storage, password vaulting as privileged access. If you look at Gartner, Forrester, Coupling, Kohler, any of the other analysts, they define it as much, much more. It's also privilege management. That also includes least privilege management. That is the management of credentials on devices, the removal of admin rights, and the elevation of applications, whether that's token swapping, impersonation, or a variety of other techniques to control the rights on a system. It also includes session management, the capability to record, keystroke log, OCR, whatever it may be, entire sessions, including GUIs and text interfaces, SSH, Telnet. Being able to track everything the end user does, and even stopping it from the command line when appropriate. Keying off of specific keywords or commands or attempts to jump to other systems, and either locking, disconnecting, or alerting somebody that potential bad activity is occurring. It's another part of PAM. You need reporting. Absolutely critical. You need reporting for who's using those passwords, what systems they connected to, which applications are running with high privileges, etc. And if you can, tie it into analytics. It's also a part of privileged access management, and it ties into user behavior monitoring. Finally, Active Directory bridging. This is the capability to essentially state, I have a non-Windows system, but I want to use AD credentials in order to authenticate. It eliminates the entire problem of having aliases, managing local passwords, things of that nature. Every Unix, Linux, and even Mac can join a domain to some degree today or use those credentials. This goes far beyond that, including even to manage their group policy settings, group policy options, so that when they log in, if you need to find where John Smith is, you can see Windows, you can see Unix, you can see Linux, you can see all their activity across the board and not have to figure out, was it J. Smith or Smith J or J.A. Smith or any potential aliases that they may use. The point being here is privileged access management is so much more than just password. It helps solve all of those use cases, and the analysts agree that if you take a holistic approach to this entire wheel, you can actually solve those privilege problems and the notable breaches that we first spoke about. So now how do we get there? Well, there's 12 steps to mitigation. As I started the presentation, these 12 steps do not need to be done in order. They just don't. They are best practice recommendations in this order for organizations that have not done anything with privileges. A best practice approach is to solve the problem and get ahead of it versus being reactive to a breach, an incident, or something else from an audit. The first is improving accountability of where your privileges are. You got to figure out where they are, right? You got to discover them. If you have no idea that there are accounts associated with a system, a resource, an application, a service account, or in a script, you have no way to manage it. You can't measure what you can't identify. So you got to discover them. Then you have to develop a permissions model. Straightforward. Who should have admin rights and when? Is it context aware that only people on premise during the day can touch these systems? And no, that contractor who has VPN access cannot on weekends. Sounds crazy, but these things are absolutely necessary to controlling when privileged accounts are used and how they're used. The rotation of passwords and keys is critical. Now, if you're familiar with the recent NIST guidance that you don't need to rotate passwords, I would implore you to relook at that NIST guidance because it absolutely states passwords that are not being used. Like you type it in once to Outlook and you don't reuse it again. You type in a PIN on your phone, it's only yours. It's just your phone. This is not a global statement from NIST that you should stop with complexity or stop rotating them. Critical systems should still have them rotated and keys rotated, because if there is a threat actor in your environment and they steal it once, they may not be able to consistently steal it over and over again without your detection. So rotation is key. The workflow and process, just as critical. Even if you're rotating and storing all of these in a password management system or redoing it with least privilege, if only one person has, quote, keys to the kingdom, or a group of people where they can go in and out at their own without ever a workflow, someone approving the process, or like a two-key type system used for missiles, then you're not helping yourself. The insider threat could be anybody. Oh, I have access. I'm just going to do it, and no one's watching me. Having that process and being able to audit it with reports is key. If you have sensitive information, very sensitive information, PCI, government work, drawings, engineering, things that could be considered almost game over events for your environment, you should be recording those sessions so you can track and look at malicious behavior, and even for training purposes, know if what they did was appropriate. Segmentation, if you're not doing segmentation in your environment, something to consider. It'll help keep privileged passwords from being misused across systems. But also, if you do employ a PAM solution and you can't modify your network, consider doing it at the endpoint. It's just another technique to get segmentation, but you're doing it at the lowest common denominator versus the network itself. And then taking all of that and spinning it into user behavior. All of this is asset-based. Finding, identifying, controlling, rotating, using, and tracking is all user-based. It's first step. If you don't know where it is, you can't measure it, let's find it, identify it, rotate it, and put it under our belt. This is essentially, as step 1 of 12, what password management really is, and a key step in protecting your organization. The second step is least privilege on endpoints. If your organization has still got admin rights on the endpoint, consider removing them. Consider how you can remove them. What do you need to do or change or update or buy or build so that an end user experience will be successful without admin rights, and not even giving them that ex-admin account or something similar for them to run the one-offs. Most of the time they need, okay, I got to add a printer, I might have 1 or 2 legacy programs, or whatever it may be. What is it going to take to do that? You'll stop a lot of baseline drift. You'll save a lot on help desk calls because the end user can't tamper with their system, and inherently stop a good portion of malware just because the malware can't get into the registry, system directory, or other places because it doesn't have the rights to get there. With that in mind, when you do that, you can now do things like enforcing application control. I am going to allow these vendors to run. I'm going to allow these vendors to run elevated as admins without ever putting in that username and password. I'm going to enable those applications to run as admins when I detect that they're on the corporate network and not off, or I'll allow VPN to run as an admin or not, depending on where it's located, and even record those sessions if needed. That might be even when a help desk personnel comes in and tries to assist anyone. In addition, things like privileged file monitoring, making sure that when someone's running as someone is an admin, or they're running a program as admin rights, don't tamper with key files. And even if you have to run a key system thing like operating system program like regedit, you require 2-factor, or that workflow approval that we've been talking about before, while documenting everything to say, in this group of users or these people, these programs were run as admins, and they actually provide a justification as to why. If you want to understand the importance of doing least privilege on endpoints, think of it in a really succinct way. Ransomware phishing attacks. If I can stop that perimeter exploitation that I covered in the beginning from hitting my endpoints by removing admin rights, I can stop many of the threats in my environment, many of them, but still allow the applications that need to work to perform correctly. That's my goal. That's the most important piece here. The third step is application risks. Look, this is a harder one here, but it is step 3 because we don't know what people are necessarily running on their environment, especially in the enterprise. We do not know all the executables that are running. We may choose a tool that is very strict on application control, and we've very much defined everything by hash, or we've said only these programs that are digitally signed are going to run, but you don't know their risks. If a machine has an older version of Adobe, Java, that's perfectly fine to run, and it may be even perfectly fine to run as an admin to support a medical program or some other diagnostic system, but it still has a risk because it may have vulnerabilities attached to it. It may have other inherent flaws that an attacker can leverage. And this is where reputation services come into play, understanding the application's risk, controlling applications by version, and measuring whether those applications should even be allowed to run becomes key. It's one thing to remove the rights, it's one thing to have least privilege rights, but it's another to understand these programs we're running are a high risk just in themselves because they have vulnerabilities and exploits. And or the programs that are running could have associated malware or other tools that are nefarious against them. So knowing what the risks of the applications are on the endpoint is key. Now, if you think about some of these first 3 steps, these don't always require solutions. They don't require a vendor solutions. Vendor solutions like BeyondTrust and others make this easy, but you can certainly do a lot of this today with the tools you may have. If you're already doing a software inventory with something like ServiceNow or BMC, you already know all the versions that are in your environment. Yeah, maybe pages of software installed. But a quick sort will say, okay, here's all the versions of Adobe 10. Let me get those people out there. Privileged access management doesn't necessarily mean you have to deploy a tool. It's a concept of best practices for removing admin rights, allowing users to work, and even measuring application risks by data we know. Many of the tools that are out there make it easy, but many of the tools that you have today may help. Step 4 is on servers. Look, I can't stress this enough. Almost all of our critical data is on servers. Yes, you think about Sony or you think about other breaches that have been out there where there have been files called passwords or financials or accounting. I get it. Someone copied it to their notebook, they put it on a share, it was moved to the cloud, or it was handled with a third party. That's a whole different type of way of looking at it. That's privileged data in motion or sensitive data in motion, could be handled by a DLP solution or other techniques. But the core of the data for our enterprises naturally resolves on servers. Those servers should not have people logging in every single day to operate them. They shouldn't. They're servers. They should be allowing people to log in for exceptions, for change control, for reasons that are above, the average login, 20 times a day to do something. Therefore, we want to monitor all privileged activity, especially to things like databases running on those servers, change control, password files, whether they're running commands and scripts. We want to document everything they see on the screen, whether it's graphical or text, alert on it, report on it, and be able to go to an auditor and say, yep, here's all the sensitive data I've collected. It's on this zone of systems or this collection of systems, and here's all the privileged activity someone did. You can watch them all one at a time or search for commands like drop database, and I'll show you all the places that someone ran a command that said drop database. This is required by almost all regulatory compliance initiatives. It's supportive of ticketing systems and API integration for scripts that use passwords. Getting a hold of your servers, while incredibly important, is step number 4 because people don't attack servers directly. Think about this for a second. They're already in our data centers. Unless we're putting them in the cloud, hopefully you have some protection around your cloud environments, they have to get to the data center in the first place in order for something bad to happen. And a lot of times that happens from the desktop or from admin rights, and that's why we saw them as steps number 1, 2, and 3. But we need to control our servers. We need to understand who's using them, with what privileges, and document what they see. Number 5 is network devices. Look, this one is just silly. Think about how many routers, switches, printers, cameras, you name it, that are not necessarily IoT, could be classified, but not necessarily IoT, that are misconfigured. That the contractor came in, gave it a password, told you what it was, and left, and you never changed it. Multiple people know what those passwords are, or, look, the password hasn't changed since it was set up 10 years ago. These need privilege management. We know we can exploit environments through printers. It's been done for years, especially with dumb things like SNMP. How do we manage the privileges on network devices that we're not normally looking at to make sure someone doesn't compromise it and use it against our environment? Let's discover what those credentials are, make sure all of those devices are unique, they all have unique passwords, and manage them. And then, if needed, even do privileged access management at the command line so we can parse commands, see if the command is acceptable to be run by the user, including the switches or scripts that may be applicable, and then submit it to the target for running, or running on multiple systems simultaneously. Let's eliminate the need for someone to ever log into a network device directly and run commands as root or equivalent so that we understand what's being done and potentially prevent a threat actor from doing the same. Now, cloud and virtual, there's a whole different set of problems here. And the reason I say that is because we've heard many times, well, I'm moving to the cloud, I must have DevOps. It's helpful. It helps automate the entire process. We get it. And, you know, from a BeyondTrust standpoint, we have a strong cloud strategy of into, out of, and on the cloud. But that's not here or there at the moment. You have to think about, from a cloud perspective, what you're doing unique on the cloud that's different than what you did in the data center. Whether that's instances being spun up and down quickly or have a short time to live, whether they're Docker and container based, whether they're leveraging specific hypervisor APIs for functionality and scalability, whether you're even allowing remote access, whether you have things like SSH or RDP turned on to those instances. Is it just a migration of your data center, or is it an all new type of workload that you're doing in the cloud, private or public, to meet your business objectives? Look, this is not trivial stuff at this point, but if you're not managing privileges in the cloud, you're not managing privileges at all. Vulnerabilities and exploits excluded, if someone can log into the cloud with a default set of credentials or credentials that are shared or any of the other use cases we've talked about, then potentially it can be accessed almost anywhere. Yes, you may need a VPN or MPLS or other technologies to connect to it, but it's not in your data center anymore. It's out there. And this is also true for any DR environments that you may have out there, any replicated environments, think Uber and GitHub. You have to consider the unique traits of what's going on in the cloud, what you're running virtually, where duplicate instances may be present, and the newer technologies you're using to do so. If you don't have licensing that can accommodate workloads that are being spun up and spun down, you potentially could be overpaying as well. You have to think about all of the unique traits, and there's no simple answer here. Every business is going to be different, but privileged access to those resources is just as important in the cloud as it was on-premise. Number 7, IoT. IoT, if you're not familiar with that, that is industrial IoT, ICS, or industrial control systems, and SCADA. Look, there is no good reason anywhere that an IoT device should be talking to the rest of your network. None. Absolute 100% use case for segmentation. From users, servers, DMZ guests. A camera should not be directly accessible from an end user's workstation. Sorry, should not. Don't care if you've changed the password or not. It should not. There should be something in between to allow access management, etc. Same with control systems. But we've seen the maturity in manufacturing, power generation, and critical infrastructure for years. They understand this. Unfortunately, in a lot of businesses, we don't. As we see people bringing in personal assistants from Google and others into their environment, we realize that even connecting them to guest wireless can be a liability, especially even at home. You have to have the segmentation. You have to have the proper zones. And then, to top it all off, you need privileges. Every one of those devices should have a unique password. If one is compromised, think Myria botnet, they all can be compromised from lateral movement or default credentials. They all should be unique. They all should be accessible through a jump host and segmentation. and you have to be able to monitor privileged activity to them. Step number 8 is a little bit cloud, but more DevOps. Think about how much DevOps you've implemented in your environment with any of the major tools today. You have a lot, you have a little, you've done none, you're very mature in it. How many scripts do you have with hard-coded credentials? How many hard-coded credentials may be present anywhere in the environment, whether it's in a system, a compiled code, anywhere? How are you actually automating without privileges? It would be cool if you could do the whole thing without it, but the truth of the matter is you can't. You need to find a way to get rid of all of those credentials so that your DevOps process does not become a privileged liability. We've encountered environments where scripts have published tens of thousands of passwords across their entire organization, and they've been like that for years. If that script or that password got out, the trouble is massive. I mean, just absolutely massive. So what you need from a DevOps strategy perspective is, one, good tools. Okay, there's dozens out there. You don't have to be locked into a single vendor in order to take advantage of privileged access. But more importantly, APIs and sample scripts that support the languages that you're using today. Whether you're doing something in PowerShell or Python, whether you just want to go straight to a RESTful API, you need something that in that script, you're going to secure the connection to whatever type of safe, vaulting, least privileged solution that you have, get the latest credentials, and then run it elevated. You want to get rid of all of the hard-coded places that can become a liability now and in the future because of poor security practices in your builds, in DevOps, in scripts, in automated deployments, and even in your own QA cycles. Look, if any of you out there is making software or developing systems, think about your QA environments. What kind of DevOps have you put in that processes to automate the standing up of machines, testing them, and pulling them down? Getting rid of that is key. Making it automated with secure credentials even better, so that if a threat actor did get into their environment, they can't get the credentials needed to do so. Step number 9, unification. Now, I covered the privileged access space in detail, but the unification story is key. None of these can operate as an island. There are many vendors in this marketplace, and rightfully so, including BeyondTrust, that do these tools, do these things. Some of them have solutions that are standalone, some of them have solutions that are integrated, and some of them do it all as a platform. The point being here is if you're doing least privilege, which is PAM, you're doing privilege management, which is PAM, you're doing session management, which is PAM, you're doing password management, which is PAM, why would you want 6, 10, 12 different vendors doing each of these different things on all different platforms when they should share and work together? When picking PAM technology, consider unification. Vendors that integrate tightly, share information, support each other's releases, have coexisting roadmaps, or single platforms to do all this work. I mentioned the Active Directory bridging earlier. John Smith. If I can report on John Smith's activity regardless of platform that he logged in with, I have a cool unification story. If I need to look at someone's activity because of whatever the investigation is, I can find John Smith. If I need to understand what his behavior has been on one type of platform versus another, I can see it. I need to see all of his sessions. I have recording. Where has he checked out passwords? I'm not jumping between multiple systems to get this data. The unification story is incredibly important from a platform perspective, from a vendor perspective, and overall PAM. This is why I mentioned that Gartner, Forrester, Kuplinger, any of the analysts think of PAM as all of this and not just password. And that's why it becomes so important to have the unified story so that the data can be shared. The 10th step is the sharing of that data in the top left, but integrating it to everything else you do. Look, PAM is not an island. It's actually a subset of identity and access management, and we'll talk about that governance in a moment, but you've got to be able to share the information. You've got to be able to take the data and send it to Splunk for adaptive response, or McAfee for DXL, for automated actions. Integration with IAM solutions like SailPoint, just as critical. This data is designed to be shared, used, and managed throughout your entire environment because it is all your privileged activity. again, including the cloud. Where were privileges being used when accessing these cloud resources? What workflow do I need to approve access to administrator X before getting to the system? Whether that's help desks like ServiceNow or workflow like Jira or even CA. How do I make this system a part of my daily processes and procedures so that privileges can be understood, policies written, procedures implemented, and the end results managed? The only way to do that is to integrate it across the entire landscape. Now, one of the harder parts about privileged access is auditing. We mentioned that you can audit sessions, we can audit keystroke logging, we can audit who checked out a password, we can audit a lot. But what do you do to audit fundamentals like Active Directory? There are plenty of tools out there that can tell you who clicked on what when they changed a phone number and things like that, and that's where we're honing in. It's one thing to be able to launch an AD tool and monitor that. It's another to actually record, we changed this person's phone number or their last name, and providing attestation and backup and recovery if absolutely needed as well. You need to go to the tools that are responsible for the environment, whether it's AD or Exchange or even Office 365 or Salesforce, and document what was privilege changed, how it was changed, and if the technology supports it, even allow it to be rolled back or take it out of the recycle bin. That little piece, or this one step in number 11, is your kind of like your sounding board, because it allows you to see, oh, a threat actor came in and added themselves to the admin group. I didn't see that. With auditing and recovery, you can look for those changes above and beyond any other type of privileged access that we've been discussing. And finally, identity and access management. Look, if there's no secret, privileged access management is a subset of identity and access management. It is that cornerstone or the Venn diagram subset of identity and access management that allows privileges to be delegated far beyond what an identity solution or governance solution does. So from an identity perspective, you assign an identity, a human being, a persona, entitlements, and it tracks all of the modifications to those entitlements on a daily basis and even allows you to revoke them, cradle to grave type approach. On the privileged access side, you're now looking for all of the activity that was done with that identity in the form of accounts, users, credentials, across password storage, across individual platforms, whether it's AD bridging and whether it's auditing. Think about it in the middle. It's a visibility play. Identity and access is saying, John Smith can do this. Privileged access management is saying, John did this. And in the middle, from a visibility perspective, you're able to say, is what John Smith did appropriate? And that's what an auditor wants. That's what you want as a security professional. I gave him access to do this. He actually did that or this, and I can determine whether it was right or wrong and do the appropriate actions if needed. And that's the final step, is getting this seamless into your identity program, whether you manually still create users and put them in Active Directory groups, or you have it automated with a tool set, is understanding that visibility play. Now, who is BeyondTrust? Look, we're one of the leaders in privileged access management, no bones about it. We also do vulnerability management as well. We've been around since 1985, and we have a solution set of tools to help with these 12 steps and handle the use cases that we've previously addressed. Our software company itself focuses on privileged access management, vulnerability management, and threat and behavioral analytics, and we do this in a single platform called Beyond Insight. This particular platform, or the Power Broker Privileged Access Management platform, is comprised of 3 primary buckets: for enterprise password security, for the automatic check-in, check-out, rotation, session recording, and logging of passwords, the removal of admin rights and least privilege on Windows and Mac so that your end users do not have to have admin rights to run applications that require admin usage. It's patented technology that actually performs a token swap, pops up a justification for the end user to say why they need this program, and then records all that information in a central database so that an auditor can see exactly what was done. And then we have server and infrastructure privilege management. This is the removal of admin rights on Unix and Linux, policy-based to control what commands, switches, and scripts they can run. So administrators, help desk, whomever it may be, can log into Unix and Linux and only have the appropriate privileges they need to run the commands that are fit, as well as on network devices. This is an agentless technology that basically acts as a jump host, inspecting the commands and then submitting them to network devices in order to run the command and determine whether it's appropriate. All of these products are under the PowerBroker family of solutions and integrate into Beyond Insight for that centralized reporting and view. It's key to understand that this platform is very modular, available as software, virtual appliance, physical appliance, or available in the marketplaces for AWS, Google, or Amazon, so it really can be as flexible as you need from on-prem to cloud to solve many of these privileged access management use cases. And if you're trying to understand why BeyondTrust, look, these two graphs state it clear enough. We do expect refreshes in 2018. We're clearly a leader in the Forrester PIM from 2016. It's nice to be the highest, and also the only vendor to be fully across the board in the Gartner market guide with everything checked off in terms of feature sets and platform support. So if you're wondering why we put together a presentation like this or wrote a book, it's in support of what the analysts have been telling us is privileged access, the steps to get there, and why having a platform to do so is so important. At this point, I will turn it back to Sarah for some Q&A and a poll.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Morey. Okay, guys, so let's jump into our last poll here, and then we will start our Q&A. At this point, if you'd like to schedule a one-on-one demo with a BeyondTrust security engineer, let us know. Select yes. I know Morey didn't, dive too deep into the BeyondTrust solutions. So if you'd like to have a deeper conversation about our offerings, please select yes, and somebody will be in contact with you to schedule a demo or even just a conversation. So we love talking. So select yes and talk to us. Let's go ahead and dive into a couple of questions. Morey, so this came in for you about BeyondTrust. So how does BeyondTrust discover privileged accounts?
That's a good question. So from step number one, the discovery of privileged accounts is difficult. You really have to get deep into a system. Back in 2012, BeyondTrust acquired EI Digital Security, which is the Retina Vulnerability Assessment solution. And we've used portions of that technology in terms of vulnerability assessment to do discovery. And that included enumeration of service accounts, inspection of users and groups. And that's how we, across different platforms, discover privileges. We've basically been leveraging technology that's quite mature, that's still available today as a leader in vulnerability management, but its discovery capabilities have been able to do these types of things for years and are a part of the PowerBroker family to do that work.
Morey, does BeyondTrust support or BeyondTrust products support multi-factor authentication?
Yes, I think I covered that on one of the other slides, but yes, multi-factor and smart card, whether that's password check-in, check-out, whether that's least privilege on Unix and Linux, or even on Windows, we do support multi-factor authentication and smart card authentication when appropriate.
So, Morey, how secure is your solution?
Okay, I'm not sure who asked that, but I will address it. It's available as software, virtual machine, physical appliance, or in the cloud. And we basically harden the virtual appliance and physical appliance to DoD gold standard STIGs. If you choose to install it as software, we have hardening scripts that will lock it down the same way. And the technology has been certified for common criteria ELA 2 last year. I think it's good for a few years to indicate that we take best practices in coding and security for our solution set.
Okay, guys, so a reminder too, I did receive a couple of questions asking about slides. So you should be able to find the slides in the handout section right now, so you can download them directly during this time at this second, you can totally download them, or otherwise we will send you a follow-up email with a link to the recording and the slides shown here today within 1 to 2 business days from now, so be on the lookout for that, and it will come from communications@beyondtrust.com. Another reminder that 25 people who have attended this webinar will receive a signed copy of Morey Haber's recently published book, Privileged Attack Vectors. Again, that is available on Amazon and Springer.com, and winners will be notified via email this week. I will personally be reaching out to you, so be on the lookout for my name coming into your inbox. That means you're winning a book. So thanks again, Morey, for a fantastic presentation, super insightful, and I hope that it was great for everybody else. We do ask for feedback at the end of the webinar, so please submit that once we wrap this up. And thanks again to everybody who attended live, and have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody. Take care, and goodbye.